Hi, I'm Kate Elliott, and this is season 4 of Narrative Worlds, where myself and a wonderful guest dive into writing craft, writing career, and all the other things that go along with the strange creative ways we move through the world. My guest today is a returnee, DongWon Song, who is currently an agent and a woodworker and has been an editor in the past. And I am just thrilled to have you here, partly because you're fabulous, of course, but also because you bring a different perspective than many of the people I talk to here who are writers. And when I asked if you wanted to come back, you said yes. And you said, how about we talk about character arcs? And I was so excited about that because when I see a lot of stuff, when people talk about character and how you develop character, a lot of it isn't how I work. So I'm just excited to get your perspective on why you suggested this as a topic, and then what you're telling people, because you're coming at this from a different angle than I am. So what is it? So when you said that, character arcs, what do you mean?
I'm so excited to be back. I had such a blast recording the last one of these that we did. I love talking about craft. I love talking to writers. So this is a true delight for me. I'll be honest, I don't remember why I suggested character arc when I initially suggested it, right? So it's been a minute since we had that conversation. But for me, the thing that drives story more than anything else, the thing that is so determinant of whether or not I'm going to like a book, is right up there with voice. So it's probably like voice and character are the two things that really drive it for me. When I pick up a manuscript and I'm like, this is great, I'm excited to see this, is if I connect with the character and if it feels like the character's arc, their choices, where they come from, those are the things that are driving the story forward more than external things like the plot coming in or random events in the world. I want to see characters making choices that are really rooted in who they are and where they come from. And that to me is always the most exciting story engine, is what's going on with this person that I'm trying to connect to and understand.
You know, it's interesting you should say that, because it is true that a story, I'm not much of a voice reader, and I'm also not much
Mm-hmm.
of a voice writer.
Oh, I
So
would
that,
disagree with that very heavily,
oh,
but
would
go
you?
on.
Okay. I don't think of myself as like a prose
Yeah.
stylist, right? But I guess I do. Anyway, that aside, but it is true that if a really strong voice will pull
Mm-hmm.
me in,
Mm-hmm.
and a not so strong voice that has a great character work will pull me in.
Mm-hmm.
I want to say something. This is like almost tangential, but one of the things I find most troublesome for me in terms of thinking about characters and character arc is, I call it the Marvel problem, in which you have all this character work in the first 2/3, and then you do a big action sequence at the end, and then I get bored because
Yeah.
I've lost my character arc.
Yeah.
You know,
Or it feels so disconnected from what the characters are doing, or it feels really forced. Marvel's a great example of this. There's many Marvel movies I really love, but the failure state of a Marvel movie is what I think of as Civil War, the Avengers Civil War movie,
mm,
where they needed these characters to fight, but there was no reason intrinsic to the
yeah,
characters' principles and
yeah,
ideals that they would fight in this way. It makes sense that these two, that Tony Stark and Chris Evans, whatever, Captain America, Steve
yeah, yeah.
Rogers, would have different approaches to how they see the world. And those approaches are really different, and that really matters. But it never made any sense that these two would be suddenly there beating the hell out of each other, trying to kill each other, or blowing up an entire airport, filled with civilians. I was like, none of this makes any sense. This is completely divergent from the character, our understanding of these characters that we developed over hours and hours of cinema, and felt really forced by editorial fiat to happen, or the plot needed this to exist. And there's a spider crawling on my laptop. Hi, spider. You're fine. Okay. For a second, I thought the spider was going to crawl onto the camera, and you all
That
were
would
about
have
to
been
have a
great.
very
That would have
exciting
been
moment,
great.
but
Yeah.
he made a left turn. He's going the other way. Okay,
Okay.
bye. Sorry about that distraction. Speaking of external plot events happening that are
But
disconnected from
but
character.
but if your character arc was that you were terrified of spiders, we would have had a different interaction at this point,
Exactly.
right?
Exactly. So yeah, so when the movies or a story just devolves into punch 'em up just because it feels like it's supposed to, it can be such a frustrating thing because it undermines all of our work that we've done to connect with and understand these characters up until that point.
So that was so. In other words, so you see a lot of stuff,
Mhm.
a lot of stuff before
Mhm.
it comes out and is published. And I'm wondering if you see a lot of these kind of flaws crop up in terms of character work, where people are like people are forcing characters to act a certain way to get the plot to work, as
Yeah.
opposed to seeing what the characters do or spending the time to build it up.
Yeah.
Like theoretically, I could imagine. I wasn't able to watch Civil War. I watched it in part and then I began fast forwarding it because it wasn't believable to me because
Yeah.
they somehow weren't able to do, it felt forced.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering from your perspective, like when manuscripts come to you, what are you seeing? What kind of flaws and mistakes? I'm going to say flaws. I
Yeah.
don't like mistakes, but are you seeing
Yeah.
that crop up over and over again that you've come to recognize?
As with all things in writing, it's sort of a slider, right? You can emphasize the character aspect, or you can emphasize the plot aspect,
Yeah.
or pacing. Sometimes we think of character and pacing as opposed. I think books work best when the pacing is rooted in the character, but that's kind of like a little farther down the road. I think when things start to really feel out of sync is when I don't understand two things. I don't understand what a character wants, like what are they trying to achieve for themselves? What do they think that they want in the world? And then the second thing is I don't understand what the character needs, right? What is the thing that's actually driving them? What is the wound or the flaw or the thing that is unresolved in them that I, as the outside observer, can look at them and say, oh, you don't want to win this war, you want the approval of your father, right? And so, this is Boromir's brother Faramir, right? Faramir writing out to his
Yeah.
death in Lord of the Rings,
Yeah.
because it's not that he wants to defend Gondor. He does. He believes in that very strongly. But more than anything, he wants his father's approval, right? So what Faramir wants is glory and honor. What he needs is love and affection from the people who care about him, right? So the tension between those two things is what drives this character and creates such this beautiful, tragic figure in Faramir that we all love.
Absolutely. And that is why, and Tolkien, Tolkien does this. Tolkien doesn't spend a lot of time doing it, but it's so clear,
Yeah.
which is that. So that's that. You talked a little bit about pacing and depth of character, and there is a style of writing in which it's very character intensive, which and I don't have a preference in terms of what I think a book should be doing, because a book should be doing whatever it is in a way that works for the readers who are going to want it. But yeah, and that can contrast with Tolkien doesn't spend as much. He doesn't do deep internal monologue, interior monologue with his characters, but you understand very clearly that that's what's going on with him, with Faramir, and that's one reason he works so well.
It's so key for epic fantasy in particular, because if you're going to have a huge cast, I need to have very crystal clear in my head what each member of the fellowship wants, plus all the people around them, right? There are dozens of people in those books that if you just named a character, I could probably tell you what they want and they need, provided I remember who they were at all. But especially, being able to hold that many people in your head is an essential thing for something as complex and has such big scope as epic fantasy to work. And that clear characterization and that clear arc to each of those characters is so much of what is going to keep people engaged and drive those books forward.
That also makes me think about the difference between a book. When a writer approaches a book, are they doing something with a bigger cast of characters? Are they doing something with a smaller cast of characters? You can do that really intensive deep dive in a small cast when there's only a couple of people that the reader has to keep clear. But it's true that with a big cast, you have to make them in a way their needs and wants and fears have to be a little more easily understandable.
There's like a concept in like character design from like video games and comics and movies about like the character's silhouette, right? The silhouette of the character needs to be immediately identifiable at a distance, at a glance of who that is. So we know, oh, that's Black Widow, that's Captain America, that's Iron Man,
Yeah.
right? We need to immediately be able to recognize them from a great distance. And you can sort of abstract this into, for your audience, when you're reading a book, you need to immediately be able to spot them and say, oh, that's that person, here's their vibe, here's what they want. You know what I mean? And then we can jump between 15 different characters and it's still relatable and quick and easy to read. And so I think a lot of people who work really well in these sort of big scope categories, whether it's space opera or epic fantasy or, you know, historical fiction, are really good at this, right?
You know, when I was writing the first Sun book, which is the Alexander the Great in space, gender swapped. The one of the things I knew was that it was going to be a huge cast of characters, and not even nearly as many as there actually are in the history, that I get to just like throw people aside and or collapse people into two. But one of the things I deliberately did, and I've talked about this before, is to begin with, I gave a lot of the secondary characters a very clear shtick, right? I'm just going to call it that. The one guy has this stupid hat.
Yeah.
But by book 2, I think readers are starting to get attached to that hat and how he uses it to display his emotions, right? And then, you know, there's the ukulele player who's the idol star, and a lot of that. But you need those things early on. Without them, but they have to reflect something about the character, not just be a prop.
Exactly.
But there's that interaction.
It has to mean something, right? It can't just be, you know, use the word shtick. And like, I think what defines a shtick from a character attribute is when it feels external, when it feels just tacked on. And I think you as the writer coming in being like, what's the thing I'm going to give this minor character? It can feel like a shtick to you in that moment when you're first doing the character ideation of like, here's the 15 people I need each of these to have a distinguishing thing. But what makes it work is when it feels more integrated into the character's experience and self-identity, right? So, you know, your hat example also makes me think of the Expanse books, right? Or the Expanse TV show. One of the characters has a hat, and it's very important. He lives on a space station. That dude does not need a hat. He does not experience weather in a way that means he needs to be wearing a hat. The hat is iconic for him and about his self-image and his self-perception. And so when the hat is or isn't there, how it appears, how it operates in the scene becomes very important for us to understand who this person is, how he sees himself, and why the hell he's doing all the things that he's doing, right? So, you know,
that's a fantastic example, because it's a stupid hat. And when I think of that character, bam, I immediately think of him in that damn hat, right?
We all think of that hat, and it's a goofy hat. It looks silly on him, but it is so integral to who he is that you can't get away from it.
So one of the things that I've often baffled by looking at advice about character building. I think when I drill down really hard into why, I think there's a lot of this stuff, it's like playing by ear, a lot of things that I've been doing without thinking about it consciously. But you talked about wants and needs, and I sometimes see people give advice, you know, make a chart for your character, and, you know, what do they want, what do they need, what do they fear, what do they you know, something else, and they use, and I don't think there's, I think that what kind of useful, if you're not coming at it from the way I am, and the way I'm coming at it is, if I don't know where they need to end up, I can't write them. I can write them, but I'm not anywhere yet with them. I just am moving them through. And eventually, as I write, I can't really start a story until I get that character, right? I have to know. So, but what kinds of things do you, I mean, you must sometimes, I know you work with writers. So are there, I don't know, tricks and rubrics and ways to tell people, here's how you can think about characters that might help you deepen them?
I don't have rubrics per se. You know, I mentioned before this that I just spent the last week in Utah recording a bunch of Writing Excuses episodes. So I'm on the Writing Excuses podcast. And one of the things I love about that team is that Mary Robinette Kowal always has an incredible toolkit that she pulls from in terms of here's a rubric, here's an acronym, here's a thing that you can think about that gives structure to this. And I find them all useful. And I'm finding myself now being like, oh yeah, Mary Robinette has a tool for that. Do I remember the details of that tool? No, I do not. But I think there are resources out there that can give you a more structured approach. I think for me, when I think about it, I do approach it a little bit more in a vibes-based way or a looser way in terms of, what is going to be engaging for the audience to connect with the character, right? Because for me, story stakes are all about character, right? I think we think of story stakes being very driven by, what are the stakes of the world, right? Is the world going to end? Is something bad going to happen? Is the character going to die? Those are things that I think are very traditional stakes that people think about. But almost all of those in story, I find, will usually be insufficient to keep the audience engaged. Because what we actually care about as people, and therefore as readers, are other people, right? So we care about how a character feels about another character, how a character feels about themselves, those kind of things, right? So to me, stakes are all about relationships. So when I'm looking at, is there enough juice here for this character to carry a book, right? Like, this is the thing I've run into a few times, where sometimes you'll have a great pitch in terms of like, this world is sick, this like plot idea is great, the villain is interesting, there's all these different elements where you're like, I love this, the vibes are great, the category is great, all of this character is boring, right? And there's no spark to the story itself because there isn't enough juice to this particular character. And that almost for me always comes from these things of like, what do they care about? How are they connected to the world? Who are they connected to, right? What do they think about themselves? And so those are for me the things that are those stakes. And I think self-perception is often the most one when what's at stake is how the character connects to and relates to their own version of how they see themselves and what their own ambition is and how that's related to the people around them, right? So whenever I see a character arc that looks flat or boring or something's not moving in the plot, I want to ask like, who is this person connected to and what do they care about, right? Who are the people in their lives that matter? And when you start adding those layers in, it can add a lot of complexity and depth. There's such a instinct, I think, for adventure stories to have orphans sort of as their protagonists, right? We see this in YA, we see this in so much heroic fantasy of like, oh, this disconnected person can go off into the world and do whatever, the Star Wars thing, right? Luke can just leave and go do whatever it is he wants to do because his parents died right at the beginning, right? And so, I think in a lot of ways, it's a terrible example because there's not that much interesting about Luke as a character, right? We're pulled in by the people around him. The other people around him are the ones that provide the context and the character depth and the arcs, whereas he's just kind of along for the ride. And I think they get away with it in that case, but I would encourage people to not put people in that position and instead think about what is more interesting about what your hero could want in terms of his connections to the people around him and the systems he's embedded in.
It's interesting because when I'm writing in the early stage of writing a book or a possible book where I have to decide whether or not I'm going to continue with it, what I'm really building is not where my audience will connect with the character, but where I will connect with the character. And I don't mean that in the sense of like they're a piece of me. I mean, or that they're me. I don't write like autobiographical fiction. I don't put myself in my books. I'm totally uninterested in myself. There's obviously pieces of me, this person is,
you're bored, we're going to be bored, right?
Well, but also to me, one of the most foundational things about writing character is what you said, relationships. We meet people who we've never known before, and then it takes some time for us to get to know them in the world. I mean, that's one reason that I know my kids well, because I've known them since they were born. So I've been watching them for a long while. The reason that my parents knew me well, right? Or my siblings, right? In a way that other people might not, depending on your family dynamics. But it's the same with characters. We begin, and I feel like if a writer is thinking about a character as a as a function, right? This
Yeah.
person will do this and then do this, and they will have these 3 things that they have to accomplish, but not what their relationship is with that character, their own understanding of it,
Yeah.
and why they're driven to write this character's story.
Yeah.
Like, why do I want to write this? What interests me about this?
Yeah.
And it could
Yeah.
be, there could be anything. It could be anything. It could be something that you're working through, something in your own life, or it could just be something you always are wrestling with about, something in the world. What would it be like if, someone had to cross a river at flood and bring other people with them? How would they do
Yeah.
that? I don't know. And I always, and I think maybe, partly I grew up in an extended multi-generational family dynamic. So I think in that sense, I've always thought about characters in relationship to all the people around them, rather than this kind of, I'm going to be the lone person walking through, and I'm not going to have, that's like that kicks me out of a book faster than anything.
Well, it's to go really broad here. I think it's one of the problems that our society faces right now is that we live in systems that keep us very isolated from each other, right? Our family units are smaller than they've ever been in history. Our urban environments are not, we've lost access to what we call third places, right? There's no gathering places. There's no incidental interaction with people around you. You always have to go out of your way to find connection with other people, right? And so I think our fiction is becoming narrower and narrower as a result, as we lose that sense of what it means to live in community and live in connection with a lot of people around us, right? And I think American fiction in particular has been so rooted in this idea of rugged individualism and exceptionalism. You look at one of my very favorite categories is the Western stories, right? Like the man with no name rides into town, saves the town, and then leaves, right? Whether this is Shane or a Clint Eastwood movie or whatever, I adore these stories. But fundamentally, that character is a complete empty vessel, right? And that's what is compelling about it is his relationship with other people around him, and our understanding of who the character is without all the external indicators of who were his parents, who were his siblings, who were his friends, right? Not having that gives us an ability to have a portrait of a character in a really deep way. But that has been sort of internalized by American fiction and American fantasy and science fiction, because the Western is really at the root of a lot of the kind of stories that we tell in genre. It's been so, again, going back to Luke Skywalker is that figure. We just happen to see him as a kid, but he is this empty vessel for us, this sort of audience surrogate idea. But it ends up so often in fiction feeling really flat because, unless you're doing a very kind of spare elemental kind of story like those Westerns are, then there's not enough there to hang your hat on, going back to our hat metaphor, you need something to sink your teeth into. You need something to feel engaged with, and you need a sense of community around a character, even as that character is out in the world doing quote unquote hero's journey stuff away from the community that they come from, right? So those kind of connections, I think, are the things that are the material of a character arc, or the material of a story that you can tell.
It's also because one of the risks of that is that if you're trying to separate the character out, that you often have to shorthand why they're so separate from people. So Clint Eastwood does it because it's never explained, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But in a lot of cases, it's like, well, okay, the evil empire killed his parents, or this terrible thing happened to her when she was a young woman, or so it's a shorthand, and then it's easy to pick things that are, I don't want to say cliches because they're real. These things really happen in the world, but they're like attenuated, right? They're like an idea of this that we can automatically react to and go, oh, that's bad. But there isn't any, there's no depth, there's no weight, there's no texture to it. It's just a thing. It is like the hat without any more.
Yeah.
Like all the things that the actor does with the hat in The Expanse. Those are the things that give it that weight.
If we go back to Faramir for a second, that is such a stock story. We've seen that story 1,000 times, throughout history, throughout fiction, through stories that we tell. What makes Faramir feel so weighty and impactful is we know what happened to his brother. We've already met his brother. We've seen what happened to him. We know how he dies. We see Denethor in the tower. We see what an awful man he is. And the tragedy that Faramir is never going to get the thing that he craves, because what he craves is his brother back in some way, right? There are all these layers to it, because even though Faramir's story is paper thin, when you stack all of these little layers like a Milky Way cake, that's where you get the depth and the nuance and the richness of it, because any single thread can be too thin. So when it's your protagonist, when you have a limited cast of characters, and or when it's the focus of your story and you're relying on something that thin to hold it together, then it becomes so much weight one thread to bear versus one side character among a million in the case of Faramir, who then you get to layer on and add that context by adding all this other detail around it.
And then it reflects back on Boromir, who's a more major character. I'm sorry, I got so excited my brain just completely stopped. There's this psychological base. I remember. So the orphan thing, people sometimes say, well, orphaning a character makes it easier, but I don't think it does. I know that it can be complicated to think about relationships that someone would have with others. And I know that it can burden a plot in the sense that you have to decide, oh, well, you know, they've got to make sure to get some money to their mom before they leave to go on the adventure, because mom's maybe mom's or grandma, right? You know, she needs enough to have her rice and wheat for, you know, a few months while they're gone, because she can't work anymore. And she was, you know, I don't know, an embroiderer for all her years, and her hands are all gnarled up with arthritis. I don't know, whatever, right? So then you have to put that in somehow. And I think that feels complicated to people. But even a character wanting to do that and not wanting to do that is part of what we quickly can tell. It's a way to build that character weight, because they're saying like, well, I'm just going to go. Too bad about grandma. Tells us something about that character, and then will tell us something about them later in the book, either because they're callous towards people, or because they suddenly realize how terrible it was that they behaved that way. Or it will show us that this person maybe risks not getting out the gate at night because they have to make sure that grandma is going to be taken care of before they go. So these things are, relationships are shorthand in that sense. It's the way people interact tells us so much about them. And it's not just, it's that difference between thinking that plots have to be incidents. I call it physical plot. There has to be an incident. Only incident matters at plot, but actually relationship matters to me as a writer just as much about plot.
Yeah, exactly. And, you know, your plot is rooted, I think, in those character decisions, right?
I think so.
And you know, kind of what you were talking about in terms of like, oh, if you introduce the family, then you've introduced all this complication. I think what people struggle with the most when they're starting out as a writer, right? And this happens, I think, late in career too, but, you know, it's remembering that it's what you're not showing is as important as what you're showing, right? That you can use the negative space around a character story to imply a lot or get a lot of mileage out of very small character moments, right? So if you want us to think about what their relationship is to their family and their obligations to it, then showing us that grandmother gives us a whole world, so that when you mention later that there was a younger sister, then I already have a deep understanding of how this character feels about family and can make a lot of assumptions that will be rewarded in a lot of ways about how they're going to feel about that younger sister who shows up later in the story, whatever it is. I mean, we're just making stuff up at this point, but like, you know,
but it's that thing. It's the Tony Stark Captain America thing. Now we have a sense of how we think that character is going to react. Are they going to be callous toward the younger sister, or are they going to do anything they can to save the younger sister or help them?
Exactly. So those tiny moments early on will be the seed of huge character choices down the line, that instead of it feeling like, oh, it's so random that they abandoned the quest to go back to their home village to save their sister, it will instead feel like, oh my God, they were always going to do that. That character, there's no way they could have made any other choice because of who they are, right? You know, I think this is a thing that George R. Martin does incredibly well, right?
Yeah.
When
Yeah.
his quote unquote twists happen, they're not twists, they are things that are deeply rooted in character that we have come to intimately understand these people and the decisions that they will make. So, you know, when the Stark mother, whose first name I'm forgetting, makes the choices that she makes to protect her children, even though we can see how that's going to break so bad for everybody, it is very understandable and relatable because we've always seen this woman to believe in family above everything else. So of course she's going to do that. Of course she's going to be driven by her fear for her children, or, you know, whatever it happens to be at any given moment. So when those books are at their best, when they're firing it on all cylinders, it is because it is a bunch of people who are so deeply rooted in where they come from, their experiences, what their needs and wants are, that choices they make feel really natural to us, even when they go counter to what we wanted to see happen or what the characters wanted out of a moment, right? And so when everyone ends up dead on the floor, we all sit there and go, well, damn, that was inevitable, you know?
Yeah, exactly. Some of my best, there's one in particular in The Law of Becoming, the fourth Duran book, where I had set up all this stuff and without thinking of, because it was all working, whatever. And then I reached an incident and I suddenly realized that the character whose point of view it was would react to an incident in a way that I didn't want them to do. And that it was going to change the entire dynamic of what came after. But I couldn't change it then. He had to act the way he had to act. I had set it up. And then when it happened, I was like, wait, this is way better than anything I could have thought of. It didn't change the end point, right? That's way off screen, but it was way better because there's not just the relationships of characters to each other, and of course the relationships of characters to their setting, who they are. You said that, who they are and the culture they're in, which we haven't even really discussed yet, and the relationship to the plot, but their relationship to the way you're writing it, right? And some people outline really, really densely and granularly from beginning to end, which is I totally understand that. Some people are total discovery writers, you know, they're just like, oh, what now, right? I'm somewhere in the middle, but that doesn't mean that if I build a relationship with the characters and with the story while I'm writing it, and I can find out things when I'm 3 months into writing it that I couldn't have thought of at the beginning.
Exactly.
Because there wasn't enough texture, there wasn't enough interrelationship with me and the story and the narrative. And that's something I think to think about in terms of character as well.
Yeah. And I think there's a way, even when you are a heavy outliner, there's a way in which you can rely on character to save you from prop problems, right? When you get stuck, you know, I love TTRPGs. I play a lot of tabletop role-playing games. I love to GM. I like watching actual plays. And I was watching the most recent season, Dimension 20, recently, which is, you know, a live or not a live stream, but it's like a actual play show. And one of the players, Brennan Lee Mulligan, on it, I noticed him doing a thing where whenever it came time for his character to make a big decision, he just stopped, like fully stopped the whole action in the show and narrated everything that his character's done up until this point, everything his character's thought about up until this point, everything the character felt up until this point, while he tried to decide what is his character going to do next. And it did two really useful things. One was, it was a great summary for me as the viewer of like, oh, right, that has been this character's arc, who's one of 6 people at the table over hours and hours of media. But also, I could just see him relying on the character and his understanding of character to help him figure out what to do next, right? And it was such this moment of like, oh, that's a writer brain at work right there. That is a writer sitting down and thinking through, okay, here's all the things that this woman's been through. Here's how she feels about her children. Here's the crisis that she's faced. And here's how she's going to then choose what is the most interesting and most nuanced version of what she could choose, you know, as her next step, right? It's not taking the first thought. It really is taking just really embedding yourself into the mindset of the character as much as possible and letting that guide you on where you want to go with your story at that point. You know, I mean, a show like that is literally improvised. So, you know, it's not plotted out in the same way that a book is, but it was such an interesting example of like how to think about it and approach those questions then I was like, damn, I'm gonna have to steal that for the future.
This is fascinating because one of the things that I've learned or come to understand, or my way of approach, is that it's the character's story, it's not my story.
Exactly.
And if it's my story, I'm going to set up and there are books written like this, and I think it's, again, I think it's fine. Write the book that you want to write the way you want to write it, and then if you can make it work, then it works, right? However it works. But there are stories where it's like, I want to have this twist here and that twist there because it's going to be whatever. And it's like, so I'm going to, again, twist the characters to do the things they need to do. But in my case, I'm always writing from the character. This is the character's story. And maybe in that sense, that's what character arc is to me. This is the character's story. They're going to approach things the way they would because of them. And it's not that I don't run into problems where I think, well, I've set up this thing and there's a disjunction here, and how am I going to bridge that gap? But that's a different issue.
You can work the problem and go in the other direction though, right? So if you have your plot set up and you have the twist that you want your protagonist to do, right? You need them to make this choice at, a third of the way through the book. You can take that and then work it backwards. Be like, okay, I know I need them to be here by this point. What makes a person do that? What makes a person betray their best friend, whatever it is? And you can work the problem backwards from there to figure out, okay, if they're going to be the kind of person who does this when confronted with this, then they need to have been a person who wants this, who experienced this, who comes from this place, right? So you can use the logic of it to go in both directions, and you can build your character from the plot in the same way that you can build your plot from the character. And I think that's an important thing to remember. So if you are listening to us talk about this and being like, I don't understand a thing that they're saying about how they think about character, I don't think about my characters that way, then what you can do is instead think about your plot, what you are trying to achieve with that goal, and then work the problem backwards to figure out, okay, now I have a person who feels like they would do the stuff that I need them to do by the end of this book.
Yes, and this is like the rubric people can use, right? It's that I've been thinking about this because I'm in an early, there's always a back burner book or two or three, whatever. I think most writers
Some
are
people
always
have very deep stoves, is what I've learned.
Something, it's very large stove. So I've written like 5,000 words of something like that, and I know what the end point is. And I realized that I needed to start thinking about what things needed to happen, because there's those side-by-side arcs. One is what I call the physical plot or the incident plot, but then the other is the plot going on with the character and their relationships. And I was like, okay, so I need these things to happen, but then when do these things happen? Where do we realize that she, hates bread? And where do we realize that she was where do we reveal that she was, in love with somebody she shouldn't have been, but we don't want to talk about that at the beginning, and because that will change a choice she makes later. And you can actually do exactly that if you can do outlining, but which is creating these structures where you think, well, I need to get them to make this choice. I need to make it clear that A, B, and C are things that they have seen. So where would those best fit in the plot incidents? Or if you don't maybe have all the plot incidents yet, you could say, I think that needs to come at about, it needs to come before this incident, so I'm going to flag it here, and maybe there'll be a place that it happens. I think sometimes people think that that's not action, but it is action.
It is action, right? And if you make those choices, can be more exciting than a gunfight, right? Like a character making a really difficult, painful choice for them can be as thrilling as the sword fight that will result from that choice they made. Fonda Lee, I think, is someone who's really great at this, of showing how an absolute master of understanding character and character consequence. If you just want to talk about character artists, we could just say go read Jade City, right? But the most thrilling moments in those books are often somebody making a decision long before they end up in the point of violence that's going to emerge from it. And I think those are the important things to remember, that can be thrilling.
Violence to me by itself, disembodied, is actually, I find it, I struggle with it. And one thing that Fonda does in the Jade City book so well is that all the, maybe not so much in the first book, which is a lot of setup, but she does it well in the first book. But by books 2 and 3, all the moments and the scenes of violence are, you totally understand where they're coming from, and they interact with both what you know of the character, and then characters may be making choices at that point, either based on the past or what they've decided they have to do going forward. And that's why, though, that trilogy works so well, because it's completely integrated. The character work is completely integrated with the violence. And anytime that violence becomes disembodied as a kind of, I'm going to shock you,
right,
it's, to me, it loses the impact and just becomes kind of a form of pornography.
Exactly.
Not to criticize pornography, but you in that sense, but it doesn't have any, it's that.
Then it's not serving a story purpose, though, is what you mean by that, I think, right? So when it's the difference between, like a story critical, moment of intimacy between two characters, a sex scene between two characters, where they come in with different ideas of who they are, and they will leave with a different idea of who they are. If they come in with one idea and leave with the same idea, then all you've done is given us a sex scene for our gratification or your gratification, whatever it happens to be. And the same is true of an act of violence in a book. If you enter a fight and leave a fight the same person, then there was no point to the scene. You just wrote a sword fight because you wanted a sword fight. What a book like Jade City does well, and what I think, martial fantasy does at its best, is entering a scene with two understandings of a character. And the people who emerge in that scene are fundamentally different, sometimes because one is dead, but, our understanding of who that person was in their death changes as well, right? And, what I think of as the most consequential fight in those books is the big sword fight that happens at the end of book 2. What I love about that is you come in with such a crystal clear understanding of who these two characters are. And at no point in the fight did I know how it was going to end. I could see it ending 6 different ways. And so it felt like genuinely random chance was determining something about who these people were going to be going forward and who was going to survive going forward. And it was so breathlessly exciting to read because I had such a deep, intimate understanding of what everyone wanted, what the stakes were, what the people on the sidelines wanted, what their stakes were, all of these things.
Yeah.
And all the choices that were going to cascade from whatever happened in this fight. And so that's when violence in a book has a point, right? That's the opposite of the airport fight scene in Civil War, where the outcome was predetermined. At the end of the day, everyone here is still going to be a superhero, right? Nothing was going to change other than, oh, we get a Spider-Man movie now. That was the only thing that was different after that fight scene than before, right? So, when I think about those character arcs and how they intersect with how we think about traditional genre storytelling beats, think about when you're going to have a fight scene, when you're going to have a romance scene, when you're going to have these different aspects. Why are you putting that on screen? Why are you showing it to us? And what is going to be different from your characters on the other side of this scene? And then I think that is what helps keep those moments so vital and exciting and thrilling that, will live on in your audience's mind years later.
I'm just getting excited about writing, just talking, because I love writing characters. And this is why I like writing characters, that for that moment when you've set everything up and then you get this thing, which is just two characters having a conversation. You're reunited with someone you hate. And what are you going to do about it? I just, that to me is actually much more thrilling than a big, than it, unless the battle scene is done so that there is this entire weight of all this character work in it. I want to quickly say, if anybody has a question, put it in the Q&A. We're happy to take questions, and I'll keep an eye on that if a little flag comes up. Can we, let me see. Oh, now move to page 3. Oh my gosh. All right. 10 minutes. There's so many things. Can you talk just a little bit about your opinion about the mains versus secondaries? Because I think secondaries also need tertiary, I kind of do like, primary, secondary, tertiary, and then the spear carriers in the background. And, once you get down to tertiary, you can at best have a kind of like, I want to get home alive from this military campaign, right? That's all you need. And that's enough for that person, because that gives them something. And it's really easy to go. But a lot of times, especially with the bigger cast, that relationship between the main characters and then the secondaries, how much, if people are thinking about doing a big multi thing, how much time can you give secondaries? How much depth can you give secondaries? I tend to think of secondaries in terms of we understand them mostly through how they interact with our primaries.
Yeah, I mean, basically every layer of complexity you give to a character is going to require more words, more screen time to fill that out, right? So at some point, you cannot spend as much time as you would on your main character on every secondary character, giving them their full backstory, where we learn about their relationship with, their families and their school teachers and whatever it is, right? So, I think of it like a layer cake, again, is the metaphor I always go back to with this. So with your main character, again, you have that sort of millefeuille of like a bunch of layers. You have their understanding of their relation with all these other people in the world, all the stakes that derive from that, all the things that define who they are. Versus a secondary character, you generally have a handful of those, right? Those that can be as few as two. If you've got more than like 4 or 5 of those relationships, it's getting real complex, and they're starting to feel like a main character now. But a rich secondary character usually has 2 or 3 of those relationships with other people. And I think the peril of adding too much to the secondary characters, to go back to George Martin, I think that's a little bit what's happening in the later books in those series, and a little bit of why it might be harder for him to finish those books at this point, because he's given every secondary character main character complexity, right? And so now we have a billion people who all have a novel's worth of information about them. So any decision, it's like a fractal tree where it just keeps growing in complexity because there's so much layered on each of those. So that a little bit to me is the hazard of adding too much depth to a secondary character. But adding not enough depth to a secondary character just means your world feels really flat, and it really feels like they're not interacting with people who are complex or making interesting choices and who can drive the narrative forward in surprising ways. It just means that they're just foils reacting to your main character. And that, I think, is when things start to feel like a video game in a derogatory way, right? Versus a fully fleshed out, enriched world. So, I would encourage people, I think having primary, secondary, tertiary makes a lot of sense, whatever structure you have to that. But when you think about that, think about how many layers you want to give those characters. So your main cast, your main 2 or 3 people have, 5, 10, 15 layers of complexity of all the people that they know. And then your secondary characters have 2 to 3 to 4. And then your tertiary characters really have like 1. They have I hate being in this mud field, I want to go home, right? Or like, my boss is mean to me, I hate getting coffee, right? Whatever those kind of things are, right? So think about how much time you want that person to be on screen, and then understand that the more layers you add to it, the more screen time they're going to take. And then that can skew your book and skew your plot in a way that you don't necessarily want it to.
And I agree with all of that strongly, speaking as someone who it is hard to not let those secondary characters start growing. I wanted to say something about, though, don't laugh at me. Oh God. Now I'm crying. Anyway, one of the interesting things that I've discovered is that I may have a secondary character who has a little more depth, but I don't have to show that right away. If that character is going to be coming in and out of the story for 3 books, I can deepen it as I go.
Exactly.
And so I can start with them having what seems like a fairly simplistic mini arc of their own. And that's actually another great way. Actually, secondary characters can be great ways in a trilogy, because you can let a secondary character have a mini arc in book 2 that when you get to the end of book 2 makes book 2 feel like it has a little bit of closure, even if there's a 3rd book coming. Because that secondary character who the reader started to know, like, they got home, right? Maybe they're not the tertiary character, maybe they're a secondary character who wants to go home. They got home, and now maybe they're not going to be in the story anymore, but you feel like that kind of sense of, oh, okay, I can let out my breath about them. They're safe now. but everyone else is still in trouble. So I got to read book 3. So secondary
second
characters
Spider-Verse
can
movie,
function. Yeah.
I was thinking the second Spider-Verse movie does this very well by making, even though that movie ends on a huge cliffhanger going into the third movie, we really get a full arc for Gwen Stacy over the course of that movie.
Yeah.
And so like it
Yeah.
it allows us to have a beginning, middle, and end arc to the structure, even
Yeah.
though Miles' story is still off on its own trajectory
Yeah.
by the end of that.
Yeah.
And so it's a way that you can use your secondary characters to, I mean, she really is like a primary character in that movie, but you know, the concept is still similar, that you can use that to sort of give the feeling of closure by giving an actual closure to a character, even while keeping your main story thread open. So sorry.
Right. And then,
yeah,
no, but no, it's a great example. And the primary character arc is still ongoing because it's built, it's kind of like running atop that, as long as it's moving forward and not like stagnated there. So we have a few minutes. Oh, we have a few. Okay. Any questions? There are no, oh my gosh, people, why no questions? So, okay, we've got a few minutes left. I want to talk just briefly. I want to get your comments just briefly about creating plot architecture that includes both action and character arc, in which the character arc deals with relationships, and also, and this is something we haven't talked about much, the relationship of the character to the setting, that is who they are and why they would make the choices they do based on who they are and how they understand their world.
Setting is such an interesting one because, you know, the systems that we're embedded in define who we are so much, right? What family structures do we experience? What educational structures, what political, economic, all of these things are so determinant of how we see the world and how we experience the world, right? So if you have, I mean, this is why, you know, Prince and the Pauper stories have an infinite appeal to us, because it is watching someone have to leave their environment and enter a new one, and that becomes a challenge to character, right? The challenge is, how does the pauper understand and sort of navigate a world that they are not trained to, and how does the prince do the same in the other direction, right? And so much of the joy of that and the fascination of that is watching how systems define character and how your character's arc begins to differentiate just from the terms that they were raised under, while still not escaping that, right? So in terms of how you like structure a plot around these things, you know, this is where a lot of visual tools can be really helpful in terms of like mapping out what is your character arc, what's your character A arc, what's your character B arc, and then how's the world changing around them. And so when you want those action beats, that is when those arcs are colliding, right? That those action beats are, you know, when somebody's on an ascending arc, someone's on a descending arc, somebody is, you know, trying to leave a situation and somebody wants the situation to be stable. Those two things are when your characters collide, and that's when you introduce an action scene, whether that's the two characters fighting, whether that's an external thing happening and them having to both navigate it at the same time. Those are the moments, you know, really when you want, okay, I need my characters to make a choice, a decision about who they're going to be for the next arc of the story. That's when you introduce action as a way of externalizing and adding metaphor and symbolism and all these layers to bring out the thematic richness, and then make space for your character to make a bold choice, right? So when I'm thinking about how to structure a book, it really is, okay, what are the Act 1 arcs? What are the Act 2 arcs? How are my characters colliding and then moving away and then colliding again over the course of those different plot beats as we go through the story? Does that make sense?
It absolutely makes sense. And you talked about this before, if I know my endpoint, how do I get them there? And that can be, you can do that as like a musical composition, you know, are you introducing a theme early on, you know, dun, 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 and then when are you going to bring it back? Or you can approach it as you can backward plot to say, I'm going to do a redemption arc about this person who's fighting for a villain, but they don't know it. And then what do they learn at each point, right? That finally makes them realize they need to leave and start a new life. So this is a simple example. And there are places you can't just have them go along to here and then say, oh, this was bad, because that doesn't work. You need to show those things, and that's action. And those can be done through physical incidents, or they can be done through, you know, interactions.
I probably don't have time to fully explain what I mean by this. but the structure for this that I find the most satisfying and most exciting is when it's like microcosms, right? When every beat is a fractally smaller version of the bigger arc of the thing, right? So
Yes,
you
yes,
teach your
yes.
audience how to read and experience the structure of the story by giving to them in bite-sized pieces over and over again. And then as that builds on itself to the bigger thing that you're trying to get to at the end, you have already given us a sense of what your plot structure is, because that's the whole thing. And then we're also getting it in these bite-sized chunks as we go through it, right? And when you can pull that off, that to me is the most exciting, most fulfilling, most satisfying type of writing that I run across. It's hard to point an example because it's like kind of hard to explain how this works. But when you
Yeah.
spot it in a work of fiction, it is so exciting to see it pulled off, you know? And so the way I think you can do that is sort of knowing where your character's starting from, understanding who they are, understanding where that you want them to get to by the end of it, and then giving them challenges along the way that are smaller versions, mirror versions, inverted versions of those things. It's you talk about musical structure, it's like a fugue structure, but using your plot structure and your narrative structure to get there.
That is so brilliant that we're going to end there. I love that. I love it. It totally speaks to me. That's brilliant.
It's a thing
as
that
I
I think you do
expected.
very well. Yeah.
I try. Thank you. This has been fantastic. I want to thank you.
This is such a delight. We could do this for like 2 more hours, you know.
We could do this. We could, This is this is the closest thing I have to a podcast. For those of you who are, so Heather Rose Jones will be here for the writing date that happens right after this at the Nebula Conference platform. Charlie Jane Anders will join me on January 21st to talk about the differences between using first and third point of view, which is going to be really interesting. I want to thank those of you who are here in person, and I want to thank all of you who are watching this on YouTube. I want to thank Nathan Lucas for being the ever-suffering, long-suffering tech person, and SFWA for providing the platform. And DongWon, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me back. This was a complete delight.
It was wonderful. Now I want to go write.